Hi everyone, my name is Mrs. Turner and I'm your teacher librarian here at Rio Vista Middle School. Today we're going to be going over research, what, why, and how, because let's face it, research is not always a pleasant experience if we don't know what we're doing, why we're doing it, or how we're doing it. So let's go ahead and jump on in. Research comes in two forms, primary and secondary sources. So what are they? Well, instead of hearing me talk about it, let's go ahead and listen to somebody else talk about it.
Primary means first or first-hand. So think of primary sources as materials that are first-hand. They're connected to an historical event because they were created during the time of the event or because they involve someone who participated firsthand. For example, if you're researching the civil rights movement in Minnesota, you might find primary sources related to Matthew Little, a Minneapolis civil rights activist who went to the March on Washington in 1963. Little listened to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. deliver his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Little wrote notes and letters about that day, and someone took photos of Little at the march. Notes, letters, photos. These are all primary sources because they document Little's firsthand experiences with the civil rights movement. In your research, you might also find this oral history interview with civil rights activist Nellie Stone Johnson, which is also a primary source.
And these organizations all got together and formed a coalition.
Even though the interview was recorded after the civil rights movement, it's still a primary source because Johnson was involved firsthand in the movement. Other examples of primary sources include newspaper articles, autobiographies, maps, government records, art, and films. As long as the item is from the time you're researching or documents someone's firsthand experience, it's a primary source. Something else to remember, it doesn't matter if you're looking at the original primary source or a copy of the primary source. They are both primary sources. Secondary, of course, means after first. So secondary sources are materials created after a historical event. Let's say you're still researching the civil rights movement, and you're looking for information about Lena Olive Smith, Minnesota's first female African-American lawyer. This article about Smith was written by a law professor in 2001, well after the civil rights movement, so it's a secondary source. Here's a web page about Smith. It was created in 2014, so it's also a secondary source. Secondary sources include books, biographies, articles, dissertations, websites, and documentary films, as long as they were written about a person or historical event at a later time. Many secondary sources get their information from primary sources. Just look at the footnotes or bibliography at the end of the secondary source to see what primary sources were used. Let's test your knowledge. Here's a photocopy of the Minneapolis Spokesman newspaper from April 1968, soon after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Is this a primary or secondary source? It's a primary source because the newspaper is from the time of the assassination. Even though it's a photocopy and not the original paper itself, it's still a primary source. Here's a book about the civil rights movement, written by a history professor and published in 1990. Is it a primary or secondary source? It's a secondary source because it was written after the civil rights movement by someone who was not a first-hand participant. This is a book of letters written by Jackie Robinson, who broke the color barrier in Major League Baseball. It was published in 2007. Is it a primary or secondary source? It's a primary source. Even though it was published in 2007, it contains copies of letters written by Robinson, a first-hand participant in the civil rights movement. Now that you know what primary and secondary sources are, have fun researching. And remember, if you need help, ask a librarian. You can call, email, or ask questions in person. Visit www.mn.
Okay, so let's go ahead. Let me go back to present and keep going. Now that we know a little bit more about primary and secondary sources, I do also want to make sure we point out that please don't ever hesitate to ask on our Bitmoji reference desk classroom that we gave out to you guys, there is a wonderful little link right there that you can go to and always ask me for help whenever necessary. So let's talk a little more about primary sources. So primary sources, first-hand accounts, okay, experiences, writings from the time it happened. Important items to look for when identifying primary sources are the date, who wrote it, and does it pass the CARP test? And we'll talk a little bit more about the CARP test in a later slide, but what does CARP mean? Well, CARP means currency, authority, accuracy, relevance, and purpose, okay? So let's look at some of the things that could be primary sources. You have writings and letters or notes. So I have a topic that I'm researching. I want to know about women who broke the barriers in NASA. So who were some of the women in NASA that really made a breakthrough for us? I found a newspaper written during the time, and it says, astronaut keeps her feet on the ground to return from space is met with fanfare. So let's see, what's the date that it was written in? 1996. Is that about a woman who broke the barrier? Yeah, it was written in the time of a woman who went to space and broke the barrier for women. So this would be considered a primary source. Pictures, here's a picture of the women who went to space. Some women who had gone to space from 1978, primary source. And speeches. So while there's no speech that I could find about a woman in NASA, I did find Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. This would be considered a primary source if you were doing a research or presentation on Dr. Martin Luther King, civil rights movements, anything along those lines. So secondary sources, accounts that did not happen firsthand, it happened secondhand, all right? So these are people who experienced the event. These are people who just are telling us about the event, all right? For example, if you have someone who's giving you a speech about Dr. Martin Luther King, but they were born in 2001, they weren't around when Martin Luther King was around, so they're a secondhand source. Okay, why do we research? What is the whole purpose of this? Why do we go through this tedious task? Well, the real reason is because we want to make sure that what we're researching and how we're researching is right. And we're not giving out false facts. So why are we researching? What is the topic of your research question? So like I said, mine was NASA, women who broke the barriers. So I just kind of start looking around. Let's say I start a search on a database for NASA and women. And I find that in World War II, in 1935, women were hired. That was kind of around the first time women were hired. Okay, that's a cool fact. I'm not necessarily sure I'll use that fact, but it's a cool fact to have, right? It could be something that broke a barrier. I'll have to kind of research it. Mary Jackson, that name popped up, women, NASA. I just looked up two things, guys. That's all I did. And I found a second name. I found an actual name for a woman who could have broken a barrier. Apollo 11. That was actually that picture that I showed you guys. Shannon Lucid, Pearl Young, the ENAC programmers, Catherine Sullivan. So these are all things that I found just by kind of looking a little bit. I could have done a Google search or a database search, and we're going to talk about that and the how and the differences between those two. But it's important to remember that when you're starting your research, you're not looking for your end-all be-all sources yet. Sometimes you'll find them, but sometimes you're just kind of searching. I kind of call this fishing. I just kind of want to see what's out there, want to put my pole and my lures in the water and see what's up. And so sometimes it's important just to dip your toes in the water and see what you can find a little bit. See if you can get a little nibble on something. And these were some of my nibbles that I found. Okay, so now how? This is the important stuff, guys. Primary and secondary sources are important. How to identify if it's a primary or secondary, but how do you do that is beyond important, okay? So let's talk about it. The absolute best way to find really great sources that are vetted, okay? That means that they are factual, truthful articles or primary or secondary sources is databases and books in your library, okay? These two ways have been vetted by people who are probably much smarter than me and have many, many more degrees than me. And they have said, yes, these are peer reviewed. These are factual things, okay? An okay way to search is internet searching. It's okay. But remember how I was talking about that CARP test? You're going to have to do a lot of digging to make sure that anything you find on the internet is true and vetted. And the please do nots, the please I'm begging you don't do this, is anything you find without looking at a resource for it. So please just don't like get on the internet and be like, oh, that one looks good, and end it there, okay? All right, so let's look at databases and archives. Databases and archives, you can go to destiny@centralusd.k12.ca.us. And you can just click on this link right here and it'll take you to where all of our databases are, and we'll get into that on our next little presentation. Books, please don't hesitate to look for books in our library, okay? These books are amazing. We purchased them just specifically for you guys, knowing that you need to do research, so please, and if you ever have any trouble looking for books, once again, don't hesitate to ask your librarian. And then how to help. So let's say it's the weekend and you're crunch time and you're like, I got to get another source. How do you find something? Well, let's say you did decide to go onto the internet and you wanted to look and find, you found this really great thing that was exactly what you were looking for. But is it right? Is it accurate? Well, let's talk about that. You need to make sure it passes the CARP test, okay? Currency, when was that website updated? Who updated that website? Who's the authority? Who gave this person the right to talk about this information, right? Accuracy. Is their information accurate? Can you check that that information that's on that website is on another website somewhere? Can it be fact checked, right? Relevancy. Is it relevant? Well, I mean, I'm hoping so at this point. If you found something that you're like, this is perfect, hopefully it's relevant to what you're actually talking about. And the purpose. Why was it written? Okay, there's a lot of satire type stuff out there, and it's important to remember that not everything is written to be unbiased. Okay, that's an important word to remember, unbiased. You want to try and make sure that whatever articles you're using, whatever websites you're using, they are unbiased, okay? And with that being said, that was kind of a quick little what, why, and how on research. Like I said, keep on the lookout for our going into actually how do databases work, where do our databases are, you know, all those different things. And I can't wait to see you guys later. Bye.